It goes without saying that we've all suffered loss as a result of the pandemic. The question is, how can we process what's happened to us, and especially our losses, in an emotionally healthy way? I've already touched on the importance of grieving and argued that grief is like a state you're in or a condition you have for a while, but that you don't have to be in it for more than a while, unless you refuse to grieve. So, how do we grieve well? My theory is that you have to go to the most painful aspect of your loss. If we were to think about losing someone who's died, the most painful aspect of our loss is that they have gone. We will not be able to see them or talk to them, be loved by or cared for by them ever again. We have to mourn the very worst part of our loss to ultimately become free of the pain. I'm sure we've all seen this, but by contrast, if a relationship ends, a sure way to perpetuate someone's pain is not to accept that it's actually ended. If we were to go back to Kubler-Ross's stages of grief worked out by observing the experiences of terminally ill people, we can see how determined people are not to face the most painful aspect of their loss. For instance, it's easier for us to deny that what is happening than to face that loss. It's easier for us to try and bargain the loss away than to face it. If I do this or that, then this loss will not come upon me. It's easier for us to be outraged by the fact that this loss is happening or by what somebody has done in the context of this loss than it is to face the loss. It's easier for us to shut ourselves down in depression than face that this loss will come upon us. Why do we do these things to ourselves? Well, I think it's because we don't want to feel pain. Experience tells me that we will go a very long way round to avoid pain, including choosing to live in other difficult emotional states like anger, denial, or depression. The heart of loss is the real absence of a person, an opportunity, a job, a relationship. And I'm suggesting that letting ourselves feel this pain, not once or twice, but as often as we need to, is the quickest way to leave the state or condition of grief behind us. People are afraid that if they really face the enormity of their loss, they will be completely overwhelmed. And to start with, fair enough, I think there is a sense of being totally overwhelmed. But in general, you don't cry and never stop crying. You cry and then you stop, and then you cry again, and then you stop. And though this process might be intense at the start, if you allow yourself to feel the real pain of loss, the intensity of your pain will gradually lessen. To grieve the absence of a person who is important to you is really a 2-year process. The first year is much more intense than the second, but the more you allow yourself to go to the heart of the pain, the more quickly you'll be released from it. So, I would let go of anything that prevents you from feeling the real pain of grief. I spoke to a young woman recently who'd got stuck in the grief process. Her father had died suddenly and a family dispute quickly flared up. It was a lot for a 19-year-old to handle. However, when we really got down to it, what helped her to move forward in the grief process was ceasing to behave in certain ways as though her father hadn't really died. For instance, she tried to keep him alive by talking to his picture and by wearing some of his clothes. Now, you could think this is completely understandable, but as I've said, the real heart of grief is allowing yourself to face the fact that the person you love has gone. In our heart of hearts, of course, we know this is true, and so really any form of denial simply gets in the way of the process. One of my daughters was determined to pronounce the end of university to be the end of university when it was cut short during the pandemic, and to be sad about it accordingly. Rather than barter or pretend that anything could be recreated that would be the same, I think of this as being wise. The simple act of allowing ourselves to feel the pain of losing someone or something as often as we need to, which will be very often to start with and less often later, is the way to come through the state of bereavement. Can we find any greater comfort in our grief, though? Let me tell you a true story. When I was about 20, my mother was diagnosed with liver cancer. I didn't initially realize that this condition was terminal and remember being really angry with the person who accidentally told me. My mother was the person I loved most in the world, and the thought of losing her was devastating. I was an atheist who'd recently become a Christian, and I decided to throw myself upon God in search of comfort. If the things I was learning about his character were true, like he is loving and kind, then God would surely prove himself to me in my time of need, I reasoned. I can honestly say that God did prove his love and kindness towards me. In particular, there were some extraordinary coincidences at key moments which comforted me. For instance, on the day some people from my church went to pray for her, the book I read every day to help me understand the Bible had an illustration about a child watching their mother die of cancer. This helped me to accept what I really knew, which was that she would die. But it also implied that God knew about my situation and that I was not alone in it. On another day, when I was praying and fasting for her, the heading in that same book for that day was called Face, Death and Live. The content was about the promise of life after death for those who believe in Jesus. This was not a promise of healing now, but it was an assurance that God knew and that she would soon be with him. These experiences did not take away the pain of losing my mother, but they encouraged me to see God as my grieving partner, and I learned how to develop a real relationship with him in which I could talk about and go through anything with him. This comforted and healed me. It isn't complex, actually, going through something with God any more than it is to go through something with a friend, but it isn't always attempted, even by people who say they believe in God. Let's play an imaginary game. Let's pretend there is a God and that he's nice and that he likes you. If there is a God and he's nice and he likes you, then he hasn't done this terrible thing to you. He's not the person who's caused your loss. And there's little point in asking why he let it happen, because ultimately, in the world he allows to exist, we can see that losses of various kinds and even death itself eventually happen to everyone. It's so much better, in my view, to take the comforting hand of God and to see him as part of the solution, rather than think of him as part of the problem. Jesus is described as a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and that must mean he understands. He also says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Ultimately, I believe God has provided the solution to the problem of our pain, in that all those who believe are never truly lost. God in Christ stepped down into our broken, suffering world and set in train an incredible process of healing and restoration when he died on the cross. Because he's risen, we shall be restored to one another in the resurrection. So we can safely commit those we love into God's hands, and in the meantime, we can pass through the valley of the shadow of death with him. If we throw ourselves upon God, mourn in his presence, tell him everything, hold on to the promises he makes to those who reach out to him in the Bible, then we pass through this experience with him. And when he speaks to us through the Bible or by his Spirit, or when he answers a prayer, our faith is strengthened, and so is our connection with him. And that enables us to keep calling out to him, holding on to his promises, etc. And so God becomes our comfort. The alternative is to pull away from God on the theory that he's done this to us or that he should have stopped it. The consequence is that not only do I have to deal with a very real loss alone, but now I also have to deal with a difficult relationship with God. My observation is that the loss of a person or of an opportunity is bad enough. Why stand at a distance from God when you could let him comfort you? In the next session, I want to address a specific roadblock on the journey of grief.